Hi everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the RSIS webinar series on ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, COVID-19 and the future of ASEAN Centrality. My name is Sarah Teo and I will be your moderator for today's session. So today's session is actually the second of a three-part webinar series. Yesterday we had three excellent speakers sharing their observations on how multilateralism in the region might evolve in the COVID or post-COVID period. So today, we will burrow deeper into what this future might look like for ASEAN and its mechanisms. We will look at developments regarding the Indo-Pacific in the recent past, particularly the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was formulated last year, and how this outlook might develop within wider ASEAN mechanisms, such as the East Asia Summit and the ADMM+. We will also touch on how the AOIP can be synergized with other Indo-Pacific visions, such as the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is being promoted by the United States, as well as its allies and partners. And I'm sure there will certainly be mentions of how ongoing major power rivalry, especially between China and the US, would alter the dynamics of multilateral mechanisms and affect the strategic or diplomatic space available to the other smaller states in the region. We are grateful to three distinguished speakers who have agreed to share their insights with us today on the above topics. The first speaker we will have is Dr. Huong, who is a senior analyst from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Our second speaker is Dr. Dinh, who is acting Director General at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. And our third speaker is Dr. Benjamin Ho, who is Assistant Professor with the China program here at RSIS. So each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and following that, we will proceed to a question and answer session. Participants may pose their questions via the Q&A function in Zoom at any time throughout the webinar, and you can find this Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen on your computer or on your device. So without further ado, I will now hand the time over to Dr. Lertu, who will start off today's session with a presentation on the evolution of the Indo-Pacific concept in ASEAN. Huong, please.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much for our RSIS team for invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, even it's virtually. As many of you, I miss traveling, I miss being in the region, I miss being in Singapore. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be with you virtually and continuing discussion online. And thank you for all the participants to join. I should start my presentation with a disclaimer that all the views I'm going to present are mine only and do not represent any institution. So in terms of the concept of Indo-Pacific and ASEAN, I think it's an ongoing conversation, one that is still evolving as we speak, but let's recap a little bit how it has evolved up until now. So obviously there are a number of Indo-Pacific concepts. I should talk about them in plural concept rather than one, because the view that are presented by the United States, Japan, India, Australia, and beyond are slightly different. They have a lot of overlap, but a lot of also of the dissimilarities, and they are still evolving, as I said. Their respective understanding, articulation, and also the scope, the geographical scope is yet to be developed, let alone coordinations, which Sarah just mentioned. So whether ASEAN vision of Indo-Pacific can coordinate with each of those respective concepts is another story that we will get to that in a moment. But I just wanted to put an extra emphasis on Southeast Asia in this particular context, because it was really in Southeast Asia that this concept has been articulated, developed, and promoted. So the revival of the Indo-Pacific concept, and we're speaking about the last couple of years rather than the original free and open Indo-Pacific that Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe first articulated in the early 2000s, mid-2000s actually. We are now talking about the revival of the Indo-Pacific concept, which started in 2017, more or less, with actually President of United States, Donald Trump, coming to Vietnam, to Da Nang, at the APEC summit, and really started to use that concept. And later on, that translated into policy document and really become the so-called strategy under Trump administration. the free and open Indo-Pacific. And of course, that terminology, that concept I've picked up in Australia, again, Japanese government, but also Indian in a lesser degree, but still. So the culmination of that, again, we had an articulation of that in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue in 2018, and of course the regional summits in November, and of course every year. Last year was in Thailand, with the ASEAN and East Asian summits and the regional summit. But in between, we've witnessed a number of high-level representatives from U.S. government as well as Australian government coming to the region, coming to Singapore in particular, and delivering a number of speeches. We've had U.S. Admiral Philip Davidson from the Indo-Pacific Commander. We've had Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia coming and articulating, as well as Minister of Defense. We've had a number of those, you know, in different forms of formality, whether it was in a think tank context, or whether it was a formal government meeting, but they've all been promoting this concept of the free and open Indo-Pacific, the term of Indo-Pacific. Yet, despite being the venue for that articulation by numerous government officials and numerous strategies, the Southeast Asian region had been repeatedly considered as the concept as vague. Right. So, for example, the recent regional survey made by the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute did a survey asking the regional so the elites questions about the term Indo-Pacific, the concept of Indo-Pacific, and majority of respondents still claim that it is vague, it is not well developed and not well explained. So there's a slight disconnect there. So that was my first point, which is, you know, despite being the central venue for articulation, Southeast Asian had been first very unclear about the concept, and in the beginning relatively reticent about how do they see the concept. There have been different views on the free and open Indo-Pacific, and some of them were rather apprehensive because of the worry that the Indo-Pacific concept could take some of the ASEAN centrality away. And other than that, of course, there was also a certain concern from the region that the free and open Indo-Pacific has been a little bit too confrontational and too targeted at China, and it's mostly about major powers, and had little space to really focus on the regional smaller powers, which are the Southeast Asians themselves. So, for example, the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said in ASEAN Summit in 2018 that, and I quote, we can all see growing geopolitical uncertainties. At the time, each ASEAN member state is subject to different pulls and pressure from different powers. In these circumstances, we must stay more united and to keep ASEAN relevant and maintain ASEAN more relevant, end of quote. So, and he referred to the American narrative under President Trump as, you know, a pressure to take sides. And unfortunately, the free and open Indo-Pacific has been associated with that hardening narrative, hardening discourse about, you know, US-China competition. So with that, if embracing free and open Indo-Pacific meant some sort of support for American vision, then there was an apprehension among many of Southeast Asian nations to do that openly. And unfortunately, like I said, there was certain confusion in terms of what Indo-Pacific strategy really offers smaller powers, rather than articulating the more direct confrontational approach to China, which was seen by many as, you know, being on the collision course. So that was the first criticism about US free and open Indo-Pacific. It was more needed to be worked out in a better way, and it was too confrontational for the Southeast Asian taste. But of course, as I mentioned, there are different variation to the free and Indo-Pacific. There's less of that confrontational component in Indian and even Australian open Indo-Pacific strategies, and particularly in Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific. And to this date, I think the Southeast Asians' view on the Indo-Pacific, and particularly after ASEAN has adopted the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, as Sarah mentioned last year, it is the closest synchronized to Japanese version, which because they both articulate the developing environment for international peace, stability, prosperity. It was addressing the goals of sustainable development and economic growth, economic diplomacy, and revitalization of the region. So ASEAN is interested in economic diplomacy, in development, and in sustainable development goals, rather than in geopolitical great power competition per se. And that's what the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific stated. It rejected the zero-sum competition between US and China. It mentioned that it is not beneficial for smaller and middle-sized countries in the region, and the region in particular. And it really, what it did, it was reaffirm the long-standing norms and diplomatic regional institutions and ASEAN centrality, the value of dialogue and cooperation for the sake of development, stability, and prosperity. So to quickly, I'm not going to go to the details of the document, but to jump to Sarah's posed questions. How do ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific change ASEAN role in the region? Well, at the moment, it does not really yet. It is still just a document, just a diplomatic initiative. It doesn't really change the style that ASEAN has developed over this more than 5 decades. What it does, it is reaffirming ASEAN's role in the regional diplomacy, its regional role as a convening power. It reaffirms the value of multilateralism. So it doesn't really add on or offer novelty in terms of how ASEAN should interact with other powers, or how should ASEAN work in the future. It reaffirms what all ASEAN has been standing for. Can ASEAN achieve the objective from ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific within this existing format? Well, I'm not convinced about that either, because AOIP doesn't really state achievable or clear objectives. It is again it's a general vision of goals and visions that are true for ASEAN and continue to be true, but it's not really achievable objective. So again, it is an issue of expectations. It reaffirms vision. Of course, it's the ideal vision, so there are a lot of hurdles to achieve those vision. We've had ASEAN Vision 2020, 25, and so on and so forth. And we yet to still get to any of those points completely. So of course, it's additional incentive, additional good in the portfolio document, but not really. I wouldn't say it is a very concrete roadmap to achieve that. In terms of how meaningful the AOIP can synergize with other Indo-Pacific strategies and concept. Well, it's not going to be easy for a number of reasons. As I said in the beginning of the presentation, all of the Indo-Pacific strategies and concepts are still developing. So there's still room coordination and synergizing. However, I don't think that it's just ASEAN outlook of Indo-Pacific should synergize itself to other Indo-Pacific strategies, but it's the other way around as well. I think it's all the Indo-Pacific strategies need to take an account of others one and work on the synergy and coordination there. So one of the criticism about the American, particularly free and open Indo-Pacific, is that there are a lot of articulations in terms of how they see the Indo-Pacific, but there is little work has been done on coordinating with other existing or even sometimes at times competing Indo-Pacific strategies. I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna just end up on the last issue, and we can pick up others along the way, which is the issue of how smaller powers can deal with great powers in this particular time. I think it is very testing time for everyone, for every single countries, given the COVID pandemic and looming post-COVID crisis as well. It is not very conducive international environment, to be honest. It's not very good for diplomacy, traditional diplomacy. A lot of meetings and summits have been canceled. They have been moved virtually, which is some kind of substitute, but not completely good enough. And it's not very conducive for multilateralism, given how most of major powers behave and act, and how they dismiss or even sideline the multilateral institutions, and there are a number of problematic issues coming out from that. So it is harder for ASEAN to defend its traditional role as convening power, as a regional platform, as a multilateral regional diplomacy platform. But it is because of that, it is going to be even more valuable if ASEAN managed to do that. Even if it can overcome the domestic political preoccupations and economic recovery and issues related to challenges to the governance of each individual ASEAN members. But it is very, I would say, critical, fundamentally critical for ASEAN to reinvent itself. It needs this, this crisis can be seen as an opportunity for ASEAN really to reinvent itself, because ASEAN has been struggling with criticism that it's in some way becoming, in a lot of ways, becoming obsolete, and it's clinging on traditional ways that not always are useful and helpful in the current time. So really, I think because it's so inconducive environment for multilateralism, ASEAN needs to prove itself. To be relevant and really carve this role as important role and defend itself, defends multilateralism. And ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific is just one way of doing that. It's not the only way, and I wouldn't say that whether it progress and develop further, the outlook of on Indo-Pacific will be critical for its success or not. I don't think it's the case. I think it's one of the tests that it can pass in the process of reinventing itself. But I know I'm conscious of the time. I don't want to take over too much of the time of my co-panelists, so I'll stop there and let my co-panelists to delve into other few points that I haven't touched on.
Thanks for the comprehensive overview of how the Indo-Pacific concept has evolved in the region, as well as within ASEAN. And also, I would like to thank you for bringing in the whole, the situation with COVID, because if we had held this seminar as we had planned to before the COVID situation had broken out, I think we would probably be talking about slightly different things when it comes to, ASEAN having to reinvent itself and what kind of role ASEAN would have in multilateral diplomacy moving forward. So our second speaker is Dr. Le Dinh Tin from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. He will be sharing perspectives about the development of regional multilateralism in the context of Vietnam's ASEAN chairmanship this year. Dr. Le, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Thiel, for being an excellent moderator We had a very interesting talk prior to the section about a topic of our common interest, which is middle power. So I look forward to learning more from you on that topic. But I also want to thank the RSIS and the organizing team for having me and giving me the opportunity to have a discussion on a topic I think is very consequential for the Asia-Pacific and South Asia today and going forward. First off, I have to say that I share many of the observations and analysis put forth by Dr. Huong on the AOIP and the contextual geopolitical landscape in which we have the AOIP and of course the COVID has a role to play here because it really delay many of the undertakings, intentions, or whatever on the part of ASEAN to go ahead with the AOIP, especially when it comes to the implementation phase of that outlook. Now, in my talk, I would like to just touch upon 4 quick major points. Point number 1 is I would like to make some references to the challenges to multilateralism today, and particularly in the context of our region. So on this particular aspect, I have to say that, in a way, multilateral arrangements and institutions in our regions are under siege. We have a lot of, push and pull and all kind of challenges from different directions. So the efficiency of multilateral arrangement in the region, including ASEAN, is put in question. But I would like also to emphasize the fact that the spirit of multilateralism has not died out. People still believe in the benefits of multilateralism, and that is my second point. We need more, not less, multilateralism in regional and global governance. We need more coordinated actions in the region and beyond to deal with many cross-border issues. And this is coupled with the fact that, because of the major power competitions, there is a lot of deficiency in global governance and regional governance that we need somebody to step up and fill in that role. I will talk about that in a minute. And it also we have to take into account the fact that we have the rise of populism and protectionism, the ultra-nationalist sentiments. All of this, again, ask for more, not less, multilateral undertaking by countries in the region. And so that is my second point. Now, let me move to the third one. So in the second point, I argue that we should, in a normative way, that we should promote multilateralism. But in my third point, I also would like to argue that we can do that. We can promote multilateralism because of the following reasons. Reason number 1, we don't have a lot of other viable options. Being without multilateralism, go it alone kind of thing, we cannot afford that anymore. The time that a single nation can tackle issues beyond its border, I think is over, including major powers. There's so many cross-border challenges. COVID-19 is just one of them that asks for collaboration, that asks for international cooperation. Not the other way around. So we don't have, other viable option rather than multilateralism. And my second point is, we have to acknowledge there is a huge chance out there, what is called the power diffusion. And, power is no longer just, concentrated on certain polars or major powers or in the hands of a handful of nations. You know, the famous example here is, for example, the United States and China just occupy for 33% of world GDP, right? So what is the rest 66% do? You know, we should be able to do something. So that's why we have to bring in the topic of middle powers here, right? And actors other than major powers. So that is something that I think is very significant here. You know, we have to play that up a little bit more. And by power diffusion, I also would like to refer to the roles played by grassroots organizations, people, businesses. If you look at the case of COVID-19, how much the business community has contributed to the fight against COVID, which is, I think, is remarkable. So, you know, we have to bring in different stakeholders here. We can do that if we can, if we can engage different stakeholders in multilateral undertaking. And here in Vietnam, we have some discussion about that. And the third, raison d'etre that I think we can promote multilateralism is there are areas, there are topics that country other than major powers can do and do it very well. And one of the example is, for example, middle powers can play the role of mediators, honest brokers, promoting a rules-based order. I think that not necessarily exclusive to major powers, and even with topic of huge topic like digital transformation. Small country can do digital transformation very well. If you go to Europe, you can see the example of Estonia, Iceland, and many other examples of countries that are being very successful when it comes to the cyberspace. There are areas that other countries can do, and we should be optimistic about that. And the fourth and the final reason here is, I think, why we can promote multilateralism and promote organizations like ASEAN and other groupings is, I don't think there should be any significant opposition from even from major powers when it comes to agenda setting or promoting a cause by groupings like ASEAN. We haven't heard any major power publicly say, "Oh, I don't like your idea," or we should stop the process of ASEAN community building, for example. So with all those reasons, I believe that we can somehow can do a better job in carrying multilateralism forward and keeping the spirit of multilateralism for that reason. Now, I would like to move to my final point here, which is that I'm going to use ASEAN as a case study here, and not a general ASEAN, but ASEAN in the context of Vietnam being the chairman this year. A couple of things here. One is we all agree that ASEAN is not a holy grail, right? ASEAN is not a holy grail. When people have it, you're going to solve everything. We have to manage expectations of ASEAN for sure. ASEAN is not, for example, not a dispute settlement mechanism, right? ASEAN is a facilitator, enable. It's not a problem solver in many cases. So number one is we need to manage our expectations, and secondly, surprisingly, right, it's still one of the most enduring and resilient and successful regional organizations in the last 5 decades. Is still out there. Maybe the beauty of ASEAN is its weaknesses. Because ASEAN is weak, so ASEAN survived. ASEAN is not suspicious. It's not generating any suspicion for major powers. So ASEAN has a reason to exist and to develop in the last 5 decades. Now, the third point I would like to say is now ASEAN is trying to switch away from being just a simple Asian sector or just exercise the power of convening others to the table. I think ASEAN has been able to do a little bit more than that by proposing initiatives and ideas and projects and programs. Let me give you an example. In the fight against COVID, in the last 6 months, even though it's challenged by from different fronts, but ASEAN has been able to come together to propose the ASEAN Fund for fighting COVID. And I know that Thailand has given the fund the initial $100,000, and the standards procedures for ASEAN against COVID has been upgraded, and information and data sharing, emergency health mechanisms has been activated. So there are actions as well, not just word and talk shop and things like that. So that's my point. Now come to my fourth point. Under the fourth point, there is a fourth point, which has to do with the role of Vietnam. So Vietnam basically has done three things when it comes to the chairmanship. Number one, Vietnam want to promote anything that has to do with community building in ASEAN. So nothing is dropped out of the plate. Vietnam want to keep everything on the table when it comes to community building. So even though 300 more or so meetings have been postponed because of COVID, but discussions somehow are still going on. And whether that's online or phone call or whatever, the community building efforts, I don't have much time to go into the details, but that effort in that year has been kept and pushed forward. The second thing that Vietnam wants to do during the chairmanship is it wants to propose initiatives. So up until now, we don't have the official statistic yet, but initiatives across the spectrum of the three pillars of ASEAN, political, securities, social, economic, cultural, and economic and trade. I hear from my colleagues that there are at least 60 initiatives or something have been proposed. And many of those initiatives have to do with very specific deliverable outcome for ASEAN and ASEAN countries. Now, the third thing is, of course, being the chairman, Vietnam has some what we call the selfish, priorities. Being the chair, we want to promote some of the Vietnam own priorities. Now, I think that is understandable, based on the fact that the chair country should, do things that has to respond to the domestic audience as well, right? So we just do not do the things that beyond your border, but also show to the people that you are doing things that are meaningful to the people at home. So on the three fronts, up until now, because it's still half of the way into the ASEAN Chairmanship of Vietnam, we still have a little less than 6 months ahead of us. And the last remaining months would be more exciting because we're going to have the EAS, the very big summit ahead of us. And there are so many items are still being under discussion. So we don't, I wouldn't be conclusive here, but up until now, we can say with confidence that the ASEAN year has almost kept as business as usual. Not to mention on certain fronts, there are progresses. For example, the standards and the procedures and the coordinated actions against COVID, even though we understand that the expectation is tremendous out there and it's not been met. Now, I would like to, I think we should do some justice to the critiques of ASEAN, right? If we say, oh, ASEAN has been doing all the good things in Vietnam, being a very successful chairman country, I don't think so. We should not take for granted that ASEAN is is giving the solution to everything. So we have to acknowledge that there are challenges out there. We know we have the known unknowns and we have the unknown unknowns out there, right? That is well beyond ASEAN capability to address. So we have to keep that in mind too. And not to mention, we have to be very frank that ASEAN has so many weaknesses on its part and on its ability to deal, for example, with ASEAN partners particularly the major powers. And I think Dr. Lê Thu Hương just mentioned a couple of things about, how challenging it is for ASEAN to deal with major powers. So that is the thing that I also want to mention. And my final point here is, by the end of the day, if you have an organization that is open, inclusive, and of course it's still an evolving process, but as long as you stay open and inclusive, I think there is opportunity for that grouping to to handle issues, even complicated issues. And just an illustration for that point is the AOIP. So my point of view when it comes to the AOIP is, I would rather see the AOIP as a set of beliefs, as is part of the strategic culture of ASEAN, a set of principles, rather than a set of projects, programs. So the AOIP is the thing that people act on it. It's a platform for people to act on it, to institutionalize it, operationalize it based on this platform, rather than the OIP just give you both the principles and the projects. I think we need to take a step or two to realize that the principles spelled out in the OIP. So that is an example. If we remain open and receptive to ideas and discussion, I think we have a chance to keep multilateralism in the region, particularly in the case of ASEAN, relevant and valid in this context and going forward. So I'd like to close off my remarks here. Maybe we should entertain some question later on. Thank you, Dr. Teo, and thank you, my co-panelists for being patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lê. I think you have made a very compelling case for the need to continue supporting multilateralism, especially in the region. And also, we have laid out your arguments very clearly about how ASEAN can actually retain its traditional role in the regional multilateral architecture. But of course, we have to manage expectations. And also you have shared some deliverables that Vietnam has as the ASEAN chair and how COVID has affected or not affected the progress. So thank you for that. And our final speaker today is Dr. Benjamin Ho, who is an assistant professor at RSIS. He will focus on China's perspectives on the AOIP and how it has sought to court Southeast Asia through multilateral diplomacy. Ben, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to this seminar. There's a construction going on, so I'll try my best to speak louder than what's happening opposite my block. In the meantime, I've got some slides, so let me see whether I can get it on screen. So my presentation will be broadly on Chinese perspectives and how the region is seen by Chinese scholars as part of a broader geopolitical competition with the United States, as we spoke about earlier. Some of these discussions and reflections are also part of, as a result of a field trip I made to China last year, not this year, last year. So speaking to scholars there and from some of the books, articles that I've read. So I look forward to your questions and comments later on. So during the 34th ASEAN Ministerial Meeting last June, the idea of the AOIP was being put forth by ASEAN foreign ministers, and this effectively states the regional's grouping position on the Indo-Pacific, while ensuring that it was seen as not taking sides in geopolitical competition. So up till then, we need to remember much of Chinese analysis concerning the Indo-Pacific strategy was really focused on the Quad, members of the Quad, US, Japan, Australia, and India, and how the Indo-Pacific concept reflected the geopolitical calculations of these four countries. But following the rollout of the AOIP, China was relatively guarded in its assessment and refrained from stating an official position regarding its support or concerns towards this document. And its latest defense white paper last year, in July, China continued to use the Asia-Pacific to describe the geographical region, more than 10 mentions, incidentally, while the term Indo-Pacific did not even appear at all. So why is China intentionally rejecting this concept, or at least not explicitly making some kind of comment about it? The answer is simple. Chinese leaders believe that a US-led Indo-Pacific strategy aims to contain China's rise. And indeed, many scholars have also assessed that unlike the Obama's administration, which was less explicit about its pivot to Asia strategy as trying to contain China, the Trump administration was more upfront and hostile in its political posture towards China, including labeling China as a revisionist state, among others. So from this vantage point, it is not difficult to see why China remains careful in accepting the Indo-Pacific terminology, because acquiescence to this terminology would mean it accepts the US definition of the regional security architecture. But there was a tacit acknowledgement among Chinese scholars and policymakers that AOIP, at the very least, reflected ASEAN member states' own initiative to advance regional security developments on ASEAN's own terms rather than having to acquiesce to terms imposed by external partners. So the fact that much of the language the AOIP document was couched in also coincided with China's general preference towards regional and international order meant there was also little for Beijing to complain about. So now we'll talk a bit about Chinese perspectives to the AOIP. Some of it may not be unfamiliar to many of us, especially those of us who are studying Chinese international politics. Notwithstanding the success of the AOIP in allowing ASEAN breathing space to engage the major powers, there are several challenges ahead. So firstly, there was a concern in China that given ongoing Sino-American tensions, and mind you, has been even more pronounced in this ongoing COVID pandemic, the AOIP could inevitably be subsumed under America's own Indo-Pacific vision, thus diluting ASEAN's position and perspective. It was also observed that in practical matters, major powers would inadvertently have a greater share and say, and thus were unlikely concede their geopolitical priorities to ASEAN's own. In other words, ASEAN was seen as having limited influence over the major powers and would not find it easy to convince external powers to abide by the rule of its playbook. I think earlier speaker, Dr. Huong, had alluded to this in a presentation. Secondly, it was observed that ASEAN's success in playing a central role was only possible because none of the major powers involved in the region could obtain the unanimous support and buy-in of other major powers for their respective regional mechanisms. So external powers were happy to allow ASEAN to facilitate attempts at regional cooperation, as this was better than nothing. It was also noted, however, that given the AOIP was not aimed at creating new mechanisms nor replacing existing ones, it would likewise be subjected to the weaknesses and limitations of current multilateral arrangements. So these include criticisms that ASEAN-led forums were only talk shops and were unable to resolve real conflict. It was also highlighted that given the ASEAN-led East Asia Summit at present was focused on economic issues, while the Indo-Pacific strategy was primarily a security issue. So there was a need for ASEAN to consider expanding the remit of the EAS to account for the Indo-Pacific. We again alluded to this earlier about whether there is a need to expand the EAS to find ways to merge the Indo-Pacific vision with existing multilateral arrangements. Finally, it was also highlighted among Chinese scholars that there was a disparity in the domestic considerations of ASEAN member states, and their respective relations with the major powers also differed greatly. So notwithstanding the AOIP, each of the 10 ASEAN countries possessed their respective perspectives and had varying degrees of support towards the AOIP. And furthermore, for the objectives of the AOIP to be achieved, ASEAN could not do so on its own, but required support and participation of external powers, thus resulting in having to take into account the complexities of major power competition. In short, we're back to square one. So courting ASEAN, my next part will look at how China attempts to court ASEAN from economic to strategic. So with this in mind, China has attempted to yet reframe the rules of the region to better complement its own priorities and preferences. Up till now, the East Asia Summit and ADMM Plus are seen as success stories to the degree that they allow external players to abide by ASEAN preferred norms while ensuring that the interests of Southeast Asian countries are respected and acknowledged by the wider world. At the same time, the sensing from Beijing was that the rules set by ASEAN, and I mean in the EAS and ADMM+, were calibrated to the extent that they privilege Southeast Asia rather than China. So more hawkish Chinese scholars also had a view that Southeast Asian countries were utilizing China for their own economic development, while the more fundamental strategic interests of China were not being achieved through Beijing's participation in the EAS and ADMM+. So hence, since 2012, China's role in the region has changed drastically due to its growing national power. China has shown greater willingness to shape the regional order and display its strength through practical actions. We have seen China begin to acquire stronger military capabilities, blue water navy, and power projection assets. Regarding territorial disputes, it has also taken a far more proactive stance to alter the status quo as seen by its island building activities over the past few years. In the realm of economics, China's promotion of its Belt and Road Initiative have also generated considerable interest among countries worldwide, including allowing Beijing to promote its geopolitical objectives through economic statecraft. So all this suggests that ASEAN-led institutions and forums such as the EAS and ADMM+ in the coming years would come under greater scrutiny and pressure from China to make significant changes, even concessions in their terms of references to take into account Chinese preferences and objectives. While changes in themselves are not necessarily a bad thing, as many ASEAN observers in this webinar would admit, the greater concern is that by doing so, ASEAN centrality will be severely diluted, and that Southeast Asian nations would have to play by the rules designed by China, and thus subjected to a Sino-centric interpretation of regional diplomacy and international relations. So one way the Chinese have attempted to do so is to propose forums and institutions that mirror existing ASEAN-led initiatives. The Xiangshan Forum held each year in Beijing is one such example, as it allows China to frame the discussions instead of being subjected to what it perceives as a Western biasness in existing defense diplomacy initiatives such as the Shangri-La Dialogue. Even the ADMM and ADMM+, which Beijing has participated in, are not fully trusted by the Chinese as entirely neutral platforms. While they do allow China and the US to engage one another, these platforms, I would argue, do not entirely ameliorate the suspicion by Beijing towards regional initiatives, especially if these initiatives do not conform to Beijing's preferences of regional order. So moving forward, I would expect China to take further steps to court the region, not just with economic initiatives, but to ultimately have regional states support its vision of a political order, including the erosion of American influence in this part of the world. So in conclusion, and returning back to the theme of our workshop, the evidence that China would want to shape regional norms and preferences to suit its own objectives are increasingly clear. Yet, ironically, one of the biggest obstacles to Chinese success of courting ASEAN would be ASEAN's insistence of non-interference of domestic politics, which China perfectly agrees and which it, but whether it adheres to the spirit or not is a different question. But to the extent it gives ASEAN states a moral high ground, for it allows ASEAN states to at least let the big powers, in this case China, to be aware that interference in domestic politics is a no-no, is a red line. So to this end, I would say perhaps the plurality of ASEAN voices and interests are a good reminder that ASEAN disunity per se might not be such a bad thing after all. After all, it's not one ASEAN, but 10 ASEAN member states. And each of these states, no matter how small, do have agency and discourse, some kind of discourse right in speaking out for their own domestic interests with vis-a-vis great powers. Of course, the flip side is there is a greater likelihood of divide and conquer strategies by the major powers, but that's a risk that many of us would have to take. So I'll just conclude with a quote taken from a book that some of us might be familiar with, and a book that I have been reading given the extended time at home. So it's a 1,000-page book, and I'm somewhere in the first volume. And J.R.R. Tolkien actually puts it quite well. Such is often the cause of deeds that move the wheels of the world. Small hands do that because they must, while the eyes of the great are elsewhere. So it's a reminder that small states, and that's probably referring to many countries in ASEAN, there is like imperative for us to act, not because of some kind of geopolitical competition, but simply because of our own national interests. And to the end, these national interests are being pursued. They may actually become the deeds that move the wheels of the world, while major powers are distracted with other issues. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ben. So you have shared the Chinese perspectives on the AOIP. And also, I mean, I really like the point is when you highlighted the nuance between the nuance of ASEAN centrality, in the sense that it is not just anything inherent to ASEAN, but also something that depends a lot on the major and other regional powers. I do think we might get a few questions on the point that you said that it is time to de-emphasize ASEAN centrality, because I think that's not something that we hear a lot where we are. So now I think we can proceed to the question and answer session. And I will actually start off with, I will combine two of the questions together, focusing on the idea that ASEAN needs, or whether ASEAN can be reinvented. And my question, and this is directed to Dr. Huong, is that what are the factors that is blocking ASEAN from doing so, and what would it take for ASEAN to go beyond this so-called traditional role?
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think you know, there are certain norms and of modus operandi that created ASEAN, the whole notion of ASEAN way, and creating the kind of habit and the norms around it is one way to reinforce the tradition. But let's be also honest that ASEAN has been evolving all this time since its establishment over 50 years ago. It served different purposes. It had different member states at the beginning, right? It was born in the middle of the Cold War, so its purpose back then was very different. Then after you know, end of Cold War, and when you know, and coinciding with East Asian economic rise and you know, the regional integration, and it has different agenda. It became much more economic and trade and integration focused. Most recently, we had, you know, ASEAN was associated mostly with that diversity that we all spoke about, the diversity of 10 very different nations within this region, and having very different national interests, and also dealing with very different push and pulls, which spoke to the weaknesses that both my co-panelists have explained. And now we are actually facing a time that it's really a challenge for ASEAN, whether it becomes obsolete completely or it can reinvent itself. Of course, it's in our most of academics and those people who study ASEAN would wish ASEAN best and want ASEAN to reinvent itself and to keep being relevant, and overcome the challenges that had prevented it to be more central, whether you use the word centrality or not. And I agree with the point that centrality must be in action and earned rather than inherently taken for granted. So you know, there is no tradition in ASEAN that hasn't been first created. So we are creating, whether, you know, rapidly and in a big way or not, ASEAN is being reinvented, and that tradition is being revised all the time. I do think that we are at the junction of time that we can that it needs reinvention, because I agree with Dr. Dinh that there's no much alternative for the Southeast Asian countries than multilateralism. So they have to defend it. How they defend it, you know, whether we call it reinventing or not, into problem solving or just convening is another story. And on that, actually, I do think that convening role, that convening power that ASEAN has had was its strength, right? It was in the time of globalization expanding, and it was in the time when all powers wanted to cooperate. Right now, it's harder because the big powers don't want really to talk to each other much. There's more hurdles, and of course, there's issue with COVID that prevents very traditional diplomacy, which is meeting and summits diplomacy and being in regular contact. So there are challenges to that convening power that ASEAN has had. But having said that, if ASEAN is able still to hold onto that convening power and prove it to be still useful in this COVID and post-COVID world, and if ASEAN can really facilitate further and de-escalate, for example, between US and China, and make them come back to the table, and all big powers come back to the table and assume that convening role, again, that is a great contribution that ASEAN can have, and I think ASEAN should defend that its value in that way. Yeah, I don't want to take all the time that for other panelists to respond to those questions too.
Thanks, Huong. If I may continue this line of questions, I would like to ask Dr. Lei. You mentioned that ASEAN is more of a facilitator than a problem solver. So do you think that ASEAN should then consider trying to move more towards problem solving, or do you think that that has its own challenges? You're muted. You need to unmute.
Yeah, the question has a lot of merit into it. Before I go to that inquiry, I would like to very quickly go back on the question of ASEAN centrality.
Sure.
So in that respect, I completely agree with the previous speakers for the fact that ASEAN centrality is not a given, right? It's not a given. It must be earned. It must be fought for by ASEAN member states. And maybe, hopefully, with the cooperation by like-minded countries like Australia, Japan, and South Korea, and hopefully the major powers as well. So ASEAN centrality is not. We cannot have a fixated perspective on even the ASEAN centrality. It's different from time to time. So I completely agree with that. Going back to the question of problem solving and facilitating, I think I have to make myself clearer that I'm not saying that ASEAN should not be a problem solver. I'm just saying that ASEAN cannot be a problem solver in many instances. But in many other instances, ASEAN can be a problem solver. One of the very big problems that ASEAN has been able to solve in the last 5 decades is there's no war between ASEAN member states. It's a very long-lasting peace between ASEAN. We talk and keep talking, but the good thing about it is, ASEAN don't go to war against each other. So, from a very, grandiose kind of thing to a very specific things, ASEAN, in fact, is a problem solver. And I think I also have to mention the economic cooperation, even though it's very modest. There is a lot of ground to be covered out there, and there is a lot of expectation and room for development. But for example, the negotiation of trade deals and the RCEP and things like that is actually playing to the interest of very practical interest for ASEAN member states. So that I think that is my response to the facilitating and problem solving question.
Thank you. I thought we would now move on a bit to talk about the great power dynamics and how ASEAN has coped with them so far. And this question, I think, if Ben would like to take it first, and then we can open it up to the rest. So to what extent do you think ASEAN can tread a non-aligned path between Sino-US rivalry? And also related to that, recently there's this development about Quad Plus meetings where you have the 4 Quad countries, and with I think the addition of Vietnam, South Korea, and New Zealand, I believe. As far as I know, I think the meetings have since stopped, but they took place for about 3 months earlier in the year. So related to the first question is, of course, that do you think ASEAN members should stay away from such Quad-related issues, given that the idea of the Quad is very tied to the idea of the US and its leadership of the regional order?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I'll answer your second question. The short answer is really it depends on how each of these individual ASEAN countries would decide how their national interests are best served by joining the Quad or by not joining the Quad. So on that part, it's not a case on whether ASEAN should join as a whole. Really, it boils down to 10 individual countries, and each of these countries don't have to, there is no obligation to consult other countries on whether they ought to join or not. Of course, some more like-minded countries might want to consult each other, but end of the day, I would say it's a very realist view of the world where each of these countries would decide based on their own national interests. So to the first question on to what extent can ASEAN tread a non-aligned path between US-China rivalry, this term non-aligned, it's a very, very difficult term to sort of break down, because on one hand, this whole idea of non-alliance movement came about during the Cold War, where many countries decided to stay clear of great power rivalry. And yet, when they say by staying clear, it's not necessarily to have nothing to do with them. Clearly, back then, the Soviet Union may be less integrated to the world than what China is right now. So the very nature of our interdependency suggests that our interests are actually aligned. So unless ASEAN is able to have some kind of regional bubble, to use a COVID pandemic term, some kind of regional bubble or regional architecture, whereby we are able to work within ourselves, and for instance, from supply chains to export markets. Otherwise, it's almost impossible to sort of distance from either the US and China, or to find a perfect distance. Of course, different countries would have to make some kind of assessment as to how that non-aligned path is being drawn, but it's not something that you can draw a straight line and say, yes, we're right smack in the middle. So there's much subjectivity and calculation. For the most part, ASEAN countries are quite happy to go by this statement that we want good economic relations with China, but we want a US security umbrella. So I would see this to be continued into the future unless the Americans decide to leave this region.
Okay. Could I also ask Dr. Lee to maybe, because Vietnam was actually a participant in the Quad Plus mechanism earlier in the year, perhaps you could share your thoughts on Vietnam's role here, and what's Vietnam's approach towards the Sino-US rivalry?
A very, very tough question, Sarah. If I solve this question, I should be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize. It's a $1 billion kind of question. I believe that the Quad Plus discussion has much to do with the fight against COVID versus any substantive topics are being discussed during those meetings. I haven't had any confirmed information on the substance of the meetings, but from what I know is it's very much an exercise by the Quad Plus to talk about issues to fight against COVID. From what I know, if we zoom in a little bit, as far as Vietnamese policies option is concerned, I don't think Vietnam going to take sides with either the Quad Plus or China or what are the major powers here. We already know the historical lessons of Vietnam going with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and the consequences are very dire for Vietnam. So we try not to be in that position. That's for one. And for two, of course, we don't like to be forced to choose sides. Not just because we don't want to take sides, we don't want to be forced to choose sides. So that's why I accentuate the role of multilateral arrangement. Because when it comes to multilateral undertaking, it's easier for small and medium countries to, they're going to have bigger space for them to have policy choices. So that is my second point. The third point is, I think one of the way to, navigate between US and China is to play the game of transparency. You don't have a hidden agenda here, and the intention is just to want to construct a very healthy relationship with both US and China. in terms of economic trade cooperation and whatever other areas that Vietnam has an interest, and Vietnam has the ability. So that is my next one, and fourth, also it comes back to the question of we really highlight. I think Vietnam highlight the role of ASEAN. So Vietnam is not going alone in dealing with the US and China, but also want to engage both in ASEAN forums and mechanisms. So that's my take on the Quad Blast. I don't know, maybe there are surprising element here, but for now I don't see it. Thanks, Sarah.
No problem. Huong, you would like to add something?
Yes, yeah, just on the question of non-alignment and neutrality, I've been thinking about that a lot as well, especially in the context whether we like it or not, but there's a lot of comparison in whether we are moving towards Cold War 2.0 or a lot of comparison to the previous Cold War and division. I don't think we can be really aligned, there's a spectrum. Benjamin, I think, put it better than me, but there's a spectrum, right, of how aligned or non-aligned you can be, and there's no, like Benjamin said, there's no perfect sweet spot. And also, given that 2 of the 10 ASEAN member states have treaty alliance with the United States, we have to remember that it's different contexts now, and a lot have security partnerships with the US. And this, and as Ben said, we still have, no matter what security arrangement each country have in ASEAN with the major power, we'll still have ongoing economic relationship, and no ASEAN country has interest in disrupting them or going away from them. So there will be overlap between, at some point, there will be some overlap between economic and political ties, and there might be time, as Prime Minister said, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said, we might not want to choose side, but there might be times that we are asked to choose sides, and it doesn't need to be a formal alliance, are you with us or against us, but it will be issue on issue based. So I would caution against that perfect idealized non-alignment. Of course, there's an interest for every country to keep their national interests at the core and remain as neutral or delay that choice as much as possible. I think that's the common sense in the region. But yeah, there is a difference in terms of how much we can expect from non-alignment now versus what it used to be during the Cold War. But Sarah, you had another question to me, or?
Yes. I mean, it seems to me that the AOIP is also, I guess, a reflection of ASEAN really struggling not to choose sides. But like you pointed out, it is the criticisms of it has been is vague, and it doesn't really have a concrete set of initiatives or programs. So how do you think ASEAN can further develop this outlook for it to become a genuine alternative to the FOIP visions? Or even if not an alternative, something that at least there are areas of synergy and connections between the two different concepts.
Oh yeah, sorry, I saw that question. So the question whether we want, whether the ASEAN wants to develop an alternative for FOIP, right? Is it because it feels compelled to respond to the free and open Indo-Pacific? In my presentation, I said that it was, reluctant in the beginning, but then it worked out a response that is, also a little bit criticized, that is not a wholehearted, it is a response because it felt compelled to the existing many free and open Indo-Pacific. So if that is the case, and if that is an argument, then that means we're already being framed into the free and open Indo-Pacific if you need to A, provide an alternative, or B, synchronize with it. So this is the first question, whether ASEAN feels compelled to do that, right? It already has, but does it feel compelled to do more of that? But in terms of synchronized, I think I've tried to argue in my presentation that it's not just ASEAN needing to synchronize to the existing free and open Indo-Pacific strategies, whether it's FOIP of US or FOIP of Japan or Australian and Indian, but whether they can also take more account of what is being considered in ASEAN. I'll give you an example. The US free and open Indo-Pacific is criticized in the region for being too China focused, too China absorbed, and even too militaristic, too more about containing and confronting China, and having not enough economic component of building and developing and contributing to regional prosperity. And in the recent AUSMIN, the Australian American high level foreign policy and defense meeting that just happened in Washington last week, the Australian made the point that the strategy needs to encompass more of the region, Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, but also Pacific, than just China. So this is also actually an agenda that ASEAN has been pushing, right? ASEAN has been hoping that great power pay more attention, especially US, pay more attention to Asia, Indo-Pacific, Asia, other than just China. So that's an example of how ASEAN really can advance and further push its own agenda and have others include that. So, Japan has been on board with that the whole time, right? With, like I said before, it's very, it has more similarities with ASEAN view on the development and prosperity. But now Australia is also advocating that Southeast Asia, South Pacific, and others should figure more in the free and open Indo-Pacific. So that is an example how ASEAN can further disseminate and really promotes its agenda with the Indo-Pacific strategies of US and beyond.
Okay, so staying on this topic of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, I was wondering, and going back to the themes of this webinar, do you think, and this question I think perhaps Dr. Lei can take it first, but do you think that in their current forms, the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus are well equipped to embrace the AOIP? And if not, what should change?
Well, I'm going to leave it up to the ASEAN leaders and the East Asia Summit leaders to decide. But the East Asia Summit is actually a leaders forum, and they discuss strategic issues. And to a lesser extent, we have the ADMM Plus as a minilateral arrangement in the region. And I think both of them have relevancy. But I agree that, again, if you just keep your agenda unchanged from one context to the other, I don't think the EAS and the ADMM Plus are going to live up to the expectations of the regional community. So I agree that there should be some innovative, some way to really make the AES and the ADMM Plus agenda more attractive, more appealing to the regional audience. And one of the areas that I think for now is, for example, the ADMM Plus being the multilateral arrangement that should take the question of non-traditional security challenges more seriously. I understand that the cooperation between the ADMM Plus countries on COVID-19 has been quite laudable. The medical corps of the armies of the ADMM Plus country have stepped up and do something meaningful in the last couple of months. So I would encourage the ADMM Plus to face head on those challenges more regularly. And I don't know, maybe someday they're going to expand the agenda from the non-traditional security challenges to a more conventional, traditional domain, including settlement of disputes among countries in the region. So there is high hope there, and I think the ADMM Plus is a very good way to build up, to add to supplement the bigger multilateral architecture of the region. So things like the ADM Plus should be created, I think. In addition to the fact that the ADM Plus itself has to, I don't want to use the word reinvent, but try to find more creative way. And then also I think it's very significant that somebody should also step forward as being the initiator, as being the pioneer. For example, you know, maybe Vietnam is serious about the ADM Plus in the AS, but what if other countries in ASEAN, you know, they want just to keep a medical agenda for these very significant forums? Then, you know, the disappointment for ASEAN and the ADM Plus in the AS will be even bigger. Now, I would like to, you know, I would like to add one more last point for the AS and the ADM Plus, especially the AS. I think it's not just a question of having maybe President Trump or Chairman Xi Jinping to go to a meeting. That is significant. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. But also because the AS is a leaders forum, so the lower level have to do their homework very, very nicely for the leaders to decide. So, you know, from what I know, they don't have a lot of time at the AS. You know, leaders go there and say hi, and you know, they look at the papers, prepare for them, and they're going to say, "Oh, I'm okay with that." You know, if everybody is comfortable, I'm fine. I don't have any particular issue I want to push. So if you know, if that is the case, then I think the lower rank of officers have to do their work very nicely. Well, I would like to add another final point. Going back to the question of whether ASEAN way has remained the same in the last years, I think there is development. So one of the very specific example is if you look back at the AMM joint statement by the ASEAN foreign ministers, you can see a very interesting formula when it comes to the question of the South China Sea. As you see the formula of some ministers express concern, you know, some ministers, not all the ministers. So that by the word some, it means that ASEAN is, you know, trying to loosen up the principles of, you know, consensus here, right? So we have a 10 minus something formula, you know, just to be able to raise such an important issue in the statement, right? So we have things like that going on. So I would encourage ASEAN watchers to dig deeper into what's going on in the official channel of business here. So that's my take.
Right, thank you. I'm glad you brought up the ASEAN way because, like you mentioned, also part of the ASEAN way is the idea that ASEAN will engage, you know, all the regional powers and try and build their capacity through this engagement. So I think I will give the next question to Benjamin, which isn't ASEAN being selfish? Because on the one hand, you know, we want economic development benefits from one major power, and on the other hand, we also want the security benefits from other major powers. And in reality, there are strings attached to any form of reliance. So how do you think ASEAN should or can solve this contradiction?
Well, I think that's a very good question. Can you have the cake and eat it as well? The short answer is actually yes. You can have the cake and eat it and get another cake. And the question really is how hungry you are and how finite is the cake. Obviously, if you are very hungry and the cake is the last piece of food that you're going to have, you will eat it. On the other hand, if you're not that hungry and there are other alternatives, you will explore other alternatives. So the question, however, would also be the quality of the cake, and whether you are willing, and how much you assess that quality is worth eating it. Clearly, in international politics, countries have own national interests to look out for. We can debate what those interests might be. We can criticize politicians for having different views of what these interests might be. But the point of the matter is all countries have got those interests that they need to pursue. So I think in that sense, ASEAN countries are not selfish in that in a very narrow sense. Clearly, they're selfish because they need to protect and preserve their own country's capacities. And I would say they've got their own domestic constituents to account to in the course of their own foreign policy. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Okay, let's see. I think we can take another question. So this will be on the AOIP and China. Huong can take this question if it's okay. So the AOIP first area of cooperation mentioned is maritime cooperation in accordance with UNCLOS. But China rejects many important parts of UNCLOS. So what do you think are ASEAN views of these actions by China, and does that show a lack of respect for the AOIP?
Yes, I mean, it's not just lack of respect for AOIP. I mean, China also is ASEAN's partner, so has signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which is also in accordance of a lot of that principles and norms also feature in all sorts of ASEAN documents, including AOIP. So AOIP is not by that way any exception, and also that would suggest that violate the very spirit of the Code of Conduct and Declaration of Conduct in the first place, and the usage or threat of use of force has been experienced by many claimant states for some time. There is, of course, that the tendency to, in official and joint statement and joint meetings, to downplay and use a very watered down language, but that doesn't mean that ASEAN is not concerned with China's action. I think in the recent, just as recent as this week, or I think this week, Foreign Minister of Indonesia have raised that issue and asked China to respect the spirit of UNCLOS, the spirit of ASEAN cooperation, TAC, as well as that are also common to what you mentioned, AOIP, which is, non-use of force and respect for international law, and so on and so forth. So by that account, AOIP is not an exception. It has been an issue that the countries, maritime countries, had been struggling with China the whole time. I think the Chinese strategy has been to, on one hand, process and progress with their own claims and their own agenda, but at the same time engage in diplomacy, whether with ASEAN or bilaterally, to downplay the tension. For example, there was a time a few months ago that some ships, Vietnamese ships or other ships, had been harassed by China, but at the same time there had been the diplomatic meetings between China and the ASEAN countries reaffirming friendliness and friendship and neighborliness. So there's this dual tactics that has been going on for decades by now. So AOIP is by no way any exception in that.
Thanks, Huong. I mean, I think it's very clear that, the great powers will always use multilateralism in accordance with their own interests, depending on the specific issue area. So we have about 4 minutes left, and I think I would like to give the final question to Dr. Lei. And I would like to focus on the role of small and middle powers, which is also a question that is close to my own research interest. So the question is, smaller and medium-sized countries or economies are generally more positive and eager about multilateralism. But how do we then get the G2 interested in and committed to upholding these rules and norms through institutions and multilateralism?
Sarah, I think you're going to answer that question better than I do.
Probably not.
My research is just very initial. But yeah, again, during my talk, you can sense that, I'm very supportive of the idea that small and medium countries should be more proactive in, at least in addressing the deficiencies in regional and global governance. left over by major powers because of major power competition. So there is, yes, there is room out there for small and medium power countries to play. According to my recent research, in the last 6 months, there have been at least 16 multilateral initiatives proposed in the world, right? I mean, sizable initiatives, 2 of which have been joined by the US, and just merely 2 of which also joined by China, and 3 of them are joined by both US and China. The rest of the initiative is created, conducted, and operationalized by small and medium countries. So, empirically, we can see, not in the spotlight, but in many cases, small and medium countries really take the center stage, and that is encouraging. Of course, we have to acknowledge the challenges and, the million years kind of challenges, the major power do whatever it want to, and small and medium countries have to do what they have to. Now, how to solicit and encourage the support from the G2 to the initiatives by small and medium countries? I think one of the things is to keep the dialogue open, to maintain dialogue. That's one. And 2 is not to play one against the other. It's a golden rule in this anarchic world, right? So you have, and 3rd, and very importantly, I say at the very beginning that we have to play the game of transparency. There shouldn't be any hidden agenda, or you try to pretend that you are dangerous, right? Do not do that kind of thing, And 4th, if you can come up with, initiatives that are substantive to create a kind of interwoven interest with major powers. For example, in trade and economic, right? So you can maintain and keep a very healthy and substantive relationship with them. I think by so doing, major and small and medium countries can, have more support from the G2 for whatever they propose. I think the list goes on, but at least I think those are the things that are very, very critical.
Thank you. I think as a researcher who also looks at small and middle powers, I think that's a very comforting answer to hear. And I think on that somewhat optimistic or positive note, I think it's time to bring this webinar to a close. On behalf of RSIS, I would of course like to thank the speakers for enriching all our knowledge, as well as the participants for an excellent discussion and for all your questions. So tomorrow, we will be holding the final session in this webinar series, where I believe we will delve more into forecasting trajectories of ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific. So if you have registered, we look forward to seeing you virtually. Otherwise, we hope to see you at the next RSIS event. So have a good evening, everyone, and goodbye.